All right, so for the last objective of this unit, we're going to talk about solving quadratics by factoring. All right, so let's start with the zero product property. So if you have two numbers, a and b, and if they multiply to get 0, well, think about what numbers multiply to get 0. Well, one of them has to be 0. So that means either a or b has to equal 0 in order for this to work. So if two numbers multiply to get 0, then either a or b have to be 0, right? So you would say either a is 0, that'd be one of your answers, or b would equal 0, that'd be another answer. So looking at this example, if I have x times x plus 2, then either x would have to be 0, that first part, or that second part, x plus 2, would have to equal 0. So that means one of my answers would be x equals 0. Well, if I solve this out, x plus 2 equals 0, what would x be? I would need to subtract 2 from both sides, so x would equal negative 2. So my two answers for this would be x equals 0 or x equals negative 2. So with the zero product property, I set both of the factors equal to 0, and then I solve each of them separately. Okay, so let's look at some of these your turns. I want you to try number 1 on your own, and then we'll look at number 2 together. Go and pause the video and try number 1 on your own. All right, so remember, in order for this to equal 0, I need to set each factor to equal 0 and solve. So I need to set x equal to 0. Okay, so that's one of the answers. And then I also need to set x minus 8 equals 0, and then add 8 to both sides. So my two answers would be either x equals 0 or x equals positive 8. For number 2, similarly, I want to set both of those factors equal to 0 and solve. So I'm going to set x plus 2 equal to 0. And I'm going to set x minus 9 equal to 0. And then I would solve them each separately. So in the first one, I would just subtract 2 from both sides. So I would get x is equal to negative 2. So one of my answers would be x equals negative 2. If I solve the second one, I would have to add 9 to both sides. So I would get x is equal to positive 9. So in number 2, my two answers would be x equals negative 2 or x equals positive 9. So using that zero product property, if I know my answer, if it equals 0, then I set them each equal to 0 and solve them both separately. All right, so looking at numbers 3 and 4, I'm going to have to use what I learned this unit with factoring in order to first write it out as factors, and then I can solve. So I can't solve these out until I write it as factors first. All right, so in this first example, number 3, remember I want the numbers to multiply to get to my last number. So I need them to multiply to get 10, and then I need them to add up to get to my middle number. So add up to 7. So what two numbers multiply to 10 and add up to 7? Think about that for a second. All right, so hopefully you remember 2 and 5 would be those two numbers that multiply to 10 and add up to 7. So I'd have my factors be x plus 2 times x plus 5. Now the new part, this unit, is now we have it equal to 0. So I just factored it. I had x plus 2 times x plus 5 equals 0. So remember, I'm going to set each factor equal to 0 now. So I'm going to solve this by first setting x plus 2 equal to 0. And then I also want to set x plus 5 equal to 0. And I want to solve them each separately. So once I factor it, I set them each equal to 0 and solve. So my two answers would be x is equal to negative 2. And my other answer would be x is equal to negative 5. And then I would be done. So for these types of problems, when they're not factored yet, your first step is to factor, and then you set them each equal to 0 and solve them out, right? So looking at the next example, number 4, remember you want two numbers that multiply to get to your last number. So multiply to get negative 16 in this case. And we're going to add up to get to the middle number, negative 6. This one's a little trickier because I have negative numbers. So what numbers multiply to get negative 16 and add up to get negative 6? So let's start to list some out. The multiply to negative 16. Well, I know if it multiplies to get negative 16, one number has to be positive, one number has to be negative. So I have negative 4 and positive 4. I could have negative 8 and positive 2. I could have negative 16 and positive 1. And I could keep going here, right? But again, I want two numbers that multiply to negative 16 and add up to negative 6. So if I try this out, negative 4 plus 4 is 0, so that doesn't work. Negative 8 plus 2 is a negative 6. So ding, ding, ding. That one is going to work. And I'm going to use those two numbers to write out my factors. So my factors would be x minus 8 and then x plus 2. And remember that new thing, this objective is that we're setting it equal to 0. So this is an equation now. So once I have those two factors, I'm going to break them up and solve them each separately. So my first one is going to be x minus 8 equals 0. My other factor is going to be x plus 2 equals 0. And I'm going to solve them each separately to get my two answers. So my two answers for this would be x equals positive 8, and my other answer would be x is equal to negative 2. All right, so go ahead and try the next 4 on your own, see how you can do with those, move on to your choice activity and that objective quiz. All right, hopefully you had some good practice this unit with factoring and solving quadratics by factoring. Until next time.